In February 2023, the Russian combat group known as Wagner announced the execution of a traitor, and they released a video of the execution itself. The man, Dmitry Yakushenko, was a convicted murderer. He had been sentenced by a Ukrainian court in Crimea shortly before the Russian takeover of that territory in 2014. His sentence continued with the Russian takeover. Not long before he was killed, he had been given an offer. Fight for Wagner and your sentence will be commuted. Yakushenko, a Ukrainian by birth, accepted the offer. Like so many others in the Russian army, and especially in the Wagner Group, he was used for labor and as cannon fodder. Realizing that there was no way he was going to survive either the war or Wagner, and probably appreciating the relative safety of his prison cell, Yakushenko decided that a life sentence in Ukraine was better than a short, terrifying life at the front. So he gathered his things and sneaked out of camp. Yakushenko actually made it to Ukrainian lines, where after a short time he was exchanged in a prison swap with the Russians. It was not a voluntary choice. When he got back to the Russian lines, Wagner was notified and came and got him. This is the last picture of Dmitry Yakushenko taken alive. His head was taped to a stack of bricks and then crushed with 3 sledgehammer blows. 3 months before, another Wagner soldier had been tried in the field for trying to defect to the Ukrainians and killed in the same way. Wagner released video and stills to the world. The sledgehammer became the unofficial symbol of the Wagner Group, a name that will live in infamy in Ukraine for a very long time. Welcome to a day in history. Today, the many crimes of the Wagner Group. Before the Russo-Ukraine War began in February 2022, most people in Europe and the United States have never heard of the Wagner Group. But the men and women whose job it is to know these things were fully aware of them. The Wagner Group had already established its reputation for brutality throughout Central Africa and the Middle East, particularly Syria, where for a time they were an integral part of Syrian dictator Bashaar Al-Assad's security forces in his fight against both radical Muslim terror groups like ISIS, as well as more mainstream groups who sought independence, or at least safety, for their particular religious or ethnic group. Wagner was deployed to Syria in late 2015 after Putin announced he would be sending Russian advisors, planes, and weapons to the war-torn country. Wagner forces numbered between 2,500 and 5,000 personnel in Syria for the first years of the conflict, and because they were private contractors not affiliated with any government, so Putin said they provided plausible deniability to the Russian government. Not that anyone really believed them when they did deny it. In battles in Palmyra, Deir ez-Zor, Aleppo, and in the oil-rich provinces in the eastern part of the country, though a significant number of Wagner troops fought in pitched battles with Syrian rebels, their main task was to silence opponents of the Assad regime. And they didn't do this by winning hearts and minds, a phrase sometimes used to describe American efforts in the many guerrilla wars it was involved in. The Wagner Group, however, did not go door to door and town to town providing food, clean water, and first aid, however. No. Their main job was to terrorize people in the areas and revolt against the Assad regime, and anyone who they believed just might be. Moving into a town or city, Wagner Group men would fan out, often randomly firing not only their personal weapons into doors, houses, and windows, but firing grenade launchers and RPGs at them too. People were randomly rounded up, taken to a public square or open street, and gunned down. Their bodies were where they fell as Wagner moved to the next house or the next town. Of course, soldiers who are bent on destruction don't simply roll into town and start shooting, then leave. Wherever Wagner went, women and girls were raped and often killed afterwards, many times in plain sight. When charges were leveled at the Putin regime, the answer was always a variation of the same theme. Firstly, those reports are rumors passed by terrorists. Secondly, those men are paid by the government of Syria, blah blah blah. Everyone knows that nothing on the international level involving Russian troops happens without Putin's knowing and go-ahead. In 2018, during what seemed at the time to be a victorious campaign in Syria, Wagner men were deployed to Central Africa as both bodyguards for various dictatorial regimes, and as literal gangsters. At the time and up through today, many of the governments in Central Africa are under siege by Islamist or separatist guerrillas looking to create new countries out of the old. What Wagner promised was safety and a ruthless clampdown on government enemies for a share of the amazing mineral wealth of the region. Wagner's most profitable effort has come in the Congo, a nation bigger than Alaska in size and stocked with some of the world's most precious metals, gems, and other resources. In Congo, disappearances, torture, the forced recruitment of child soldiers, looting, and sexual violence were and are Wagner's way of removing resistance to the regime, though most of Wagner's victims have had nothing whatsoever to do with rebellion. Though some may have been protesting the abysmal working and living conditions for the tens of thousands of miners and laborers, none of whom got a share of what they dug from the ground. In 2018, 3 Russian journalists were ambushed and killed by Wagner forces in the Central African Republic, or CAR, because they wanted to find out what Wagner was really up to in Africa. In the CAR, as well as in the many other African countries they either have or are currently deployed to, the same seemingly indiscriminate atrocities have taken place. Besides the Congo and CAR, Wagner has been deployed in Mali, Sudan, post-Gaddafi Libya, Mozambique, and Niger. In all of them, Wagner personnel have been accused of war crimes. Wagner was formed in 2014 during the first stages of Putin's covert operations in Crimea. At the time of the Crimean operation, Wagner had not been fully formed, or at least acknowledged openly by the Russian government when the Crimean operation began. But the success of that operation meant that the men who took part and the group they were a part of became one of Vladimir Putin's most valued and trusted units at the time. Throughout fighting between Ukraine and Russia over Donetsk and Luhansk provinces in the years before the 2022 invasion, Wagner was assigned not only to parts of the front line, but to anti-insurgency activity. According to the last census, data available for the two regions show that ethnic Ukrainians made up between 56% and 58% of the population, belying Putin's claim that most people there were Russians, or wanted to be. And though a large number of ethnic Russians living in the Donbas region wanted to live within Russia, many did not. And for those, and anyone either Ukrainian or Russian, who called for the Russian army to leave, was risking a visit by Wagner. Wagner visits were usually not first warnings, they were final. Throughout the occupied territories, Wagner executioners killed anyone suspected of working with or being sympathetic to Ukraine. Execution, sometimes done in full view of the public, were what weighted anyone suspected of disloyalty. Actually, those executed with a bullet were among the lucky. Within a very short time, the men of Wagner developed a reputation for brutality not seen in Ukraine since the days of the Nazi invasion in World War II. Wagner was founded by Dmitry Utkin, a former lieutenant in the GRU, the Red Army's intelligence branch. Utkin's radio call sign was Wagner, and that is the origin of the name. Within a short time, one of Vladimir Putin's most loyal lackeys, Yevgeny Prigozhin, who had been a career criminal as a youth and had worked his way up to the highest levels with the aid of Putin, who Prigozhin had gotten to know in the early 1990s in St. Petersburg. Prigozhin had no military experience. He had worked his way up in the food service industry, beginning with a simple hot dog stand and then branching out. Succeeding in business in Russia, especially in the big cities in the 1990s, was not easy. You had to be tough, connected, and willing to use violence, or else the mafia would close you down quickly. By 2014, Prigozhin was a wealthy, powerful, and well-connected man, and he and Utkin began recruiting veterans from the brutal Russian border wars of the late 90s and early 2000s in Chechnya and Georgia. If Putin, Utkin, and Prigozhin wanted serious men for Wagner, they got them. Not a day went by in Chechnya that a war crime did not take place. The first time many people around the world heard of the Wagner Group, it was after Bucha. In Ukraine, at least, the name Bucha has become synonymous with Russian brutality throughout the country. When the Russians invaded Ukraine in February 2022, they planned to seize the Hostomel airport near Kiev with airborne shock troops who would hold the airport until Russian armor could arrive and then begin to use the airport as a supply point close to the Ukraine capital. Simultaneously, other units would drive towards the capital. We all know that all those drives failed, But while the initial victory at Kiev came at a surprisingly light cost for the Ukrainians, throughout the area briefly held by the Russians, atrocities began. And that's when the names Bucha and Wagner became known and linked together forever. At the end of March 2022, Russian forces retreated from Kiev and the surrounding area, including a town that most people in the world outside Ukraine ever knew existed. They probably wouldn't know it existed today, but the Wagner Group made sure that the name Bucha will live in infamy. Bucha is about 20 miles from Kiev to the northwest and was occupied by Russian forces at the beginning of March. Before their retreat, word had gotten out of the town, likely by both Ukrainian patriots inside the town or bad communications discipline on the part of the Russians, but no one was quite sure what they would find when the Wagner and the other Russian troops in the Bucha area retreated. What Ukrainian forces and the media found in Bucha was a picture out of World War II Ukraine, not the Ukraine of 2022. At least that's what people had believed before the Russians invaded. Over 400 bodies were found, many in mass graves with their hands bound behind their backs and shot in the back of the neck, execution Soviet style. Torture chambers were found in old dormitories and basements, most of them involving electrocution, though mock executions, beatings, and rape occurred throughout the city and the occupation. Many older women sacrificed their bodies to protect young women and girls hiding in the area. The people whose bodies are seen on the street in the now famous photograph were simply walking down the street and gunned down as the Russians were getting ready to leave. Wagner troops, some of whom had taken part in some truly atrocious fighting in the Chechen wars, were scattered among regular units and, in many cases, were ordered what to do. The occupation of Bucha was precisely like the occupation of the many small towns Wagner took in Central Africa and still holds to this day. A constant atmosphere of fear and intimidation of the populace, and a ruthless stamping out of any resistance, real or imagined. When Yevgeny Prigozhin and a large part of the Wagner Group mutinied in June 2023, it was over the massive numbers of casualties that Wagner was taking in the assault on the city of Bakhmut and Donetsk, and the lack of material support they were getting from Moscow. Amazingly, Prigozhin made a video in which he accused the Russian high command of doing these things intentionally to weaken Wagner, which Prigozhin said was a threat to the position of the Red Army and its influence with Putin. But no Ukrainian, in uniform or not, was sorry to see Wagner leave Bakhmut much weaker than when they arrived. By June 2023, Wagner soldiers at this point, many of them convicts, were sometimes quite literally forced at gunpoint to advance across hundreds of yards of no man's land towards the Ukrainians, who cut them down en masse, took out their frustration and fear on the remaining local populace. Not that they needed the excuse of having been in a combat zone for months on end. Orders from Wagner Group command were unwritten and straightforward, but understood. Keep the population in line, whatever that meant, and in Bakhmut, that meant many more torture chambers and bombed-out building basements and snatch and grab disappearances of men and women on the street. Members of the Wagner Group, along with Vladimir Putin, are on an arrest-on-site order in the EU. This is because a warrant from the International Criminal Court in The Hague in the Netherlands was issued for the kidnapping of Ukrainian children, ostensibly for their own protection, while the Russian families they have gone to have either mistreated them or perhaps fortunately helped them become part of the very occasional release programs set up by the Russians as a PR stunt. Everywhere they have operated in Ukraine, Wagner has been part of the Russian effort to both terrorize parents and relatives in Ukraine and to fill the heads of young children with the idea that Ukraine has been and will always be part of Russia. Soldiers with skulls and crossbones, masks and machine guns don't usually put people at ease, especially children. Throughout the war, human rights organizations, both from within Ukraine and from around the world, have investigated the crimes perpetrated by the men of the Wagner Group. Russian POWs and Ukrainian hands have repeatedly mentioned the work of Wagner, including mass executions by beheading, which resulted in the placing of severed heads on metal spikes. Ukrainian POWs who were officially exchanged in prisoner swaps told of other prisoners being beheaded. In April 2023, the world unfortunately got to see Wagner in action when they cut off a Ukrainian prisoner's head with an axe. Russian prisons have a reputation for being some of the most brutal on earth. If the guards don't kill you, the convicts might. If neither of those gets you, odds are you're in Siberia. And it gets pretty chilly there. Wagner made headlines in late 2022 as the war began to look as if it might not go the way Putin had planned. Partly because of their high attrition rate on the field, Wagner decided to fill its ranks again with prisoners. Convicts, depending on circumstances, could have their sentences commuted or even ended, along with good pay, uniforms, food, and a chance, to put it in Prigozhin's words, to be a hero for Russia. The vast majority of the men who volunteered are dead now. They died within weeks of joining, sometimes days. The worst part is that they were told they would be given at least some training, but most of them, if they were lucky, got to fire a round or two before heading to the front. And when they got to the front, it was often men from Wagner who were waiting for them, to push them at gunpoint towards the enemy and shoot them if they tried to retreat. There are a fortunate few alive today in Ukrainian POW camps, where they've told their stories in many videos available on YouTube. Longtime Wagner troops forced thousands of men with no training and sometimes a weapon they did not know how to use into certain death, something the Red Army was and is no stranger to either. When Prigozhin's and Wagner's extraordinary coup failed and Prigozhin mysteriously died in a plane crash not long after, most people thought Wagner was finished. It's not. Wagner is mainly off the front lines and serving as occupation troops throughout the Donetsk and Luhansk regions. As recently as March and May of this year, the UN released information about Wagner's continuing role in deportations of both children and adults, forcing men and boys into uniform against their wishes, and arresting and often torturing people at random, hoping they will get some information on the Ukrainian intelligence network in the area. And that fear of arrest will keep the rest of the people in line. Thank you for watching. See you next time.